Jason Arday has been in the news for nearly 4 weeks. A month-long campaign that went beyond scrutiny became harassment and abuse, leading to the tragic news of his death. But the origins of the story are coming to light. A man named Nathan Coffners, he is too an academic, but what he advocates for is pure pseudo-science, especially race science. Here is Confus admitting to the reason as to why he broke the Arday story.
Now, Arday was special. The reason Arday is getting a lot of attention is he took the plagiarism, which is fairly common in academia, too far. And he told these crazy lies about his personal life. And he had such an exalted position that the mismatch between the quality and the prestige was so enormous that there was a hook for a story. That was what was special about him. Not that he's a fraud, not that he's a worthless scholar. It's that there was a story. There's a basis for a news story that would capture people's attention. But, there are so many cases of people who are just like Arday, but, there isn't that kind of story potential. Well, maybe the lesson is this: what's happened if you don't give Coffness a job, right?
Yeah, you got your own ways to retaliate. What are you going to do, you think? You going to finish your PhD? Or no, you've already finished it. You're just going to...
No, I finished a long time ago, yeah.
Yeah, so what are you going to do?
Well, I have the job currently, and I'm still waiting for the revolution to happen, and then
it's going to take a while.
Get another job. After the revolution, I'll be the head of the Department of Eugenics and Race Science at Harvard.
That's the master race, everybody. It's clear what's going on here. A eugenicist and a proponent of the false race science myth was personally upset at the success of a black academic. Therefore, he concocted this story and fed it to the media, ending his remarks claiming he would be head of the Department of Eugenics and Race Science. He also claims that if meritocracy existed, there would be no Harvard black professors. Now, Confus was banking on the fact that the media would cover Jason Arday, but in a way, they wouldn't have with a white counterpart. As you can see from this Instagram post, these are examples of plagiarism, and look who kept their jobs. According to The Observer, Confus is a self-described race realist whose academic research focuses on the philosophy of biology and ethics. In February 2024, he published a post on Substack in which he claims that race is linked to intelligence and that without DEI initiatives, there will be no black academics at Harvard, and that under a colorblind system, black people would disappear from almost all high-profile positions outside of sport and entertainment. He called for a revolution against the DEI devil and for people to accept that talent is not distributed equally within or across groups. Now, why hasn't that had wall-to-wall coverage? A man with such grotesque views gets a complete pass from the media. In fact, back in 2024, the Times platformed his cheerleaders. Don't sack Cambridge academic for race views, say colleagues. And they've done a piece on what his colleagues say. Now that's funny. I mean, why didn't the mainstream media give as much coverage to Jason Arday's defenders? Now, if everything that had been claimed about Arday was true, the way the media covered him was still not proportionate. It was dripping in racism, from discussions around DEI to the sheer volume of articles, over 200 of them. However, much of the claims against Arday was simply not true. His supposed plagiarism featured across the entire media ecosystem, yet it turns out he was cleared. Entirely false allegations of plagiarism were made against Professor Arday and referred to 2 universities. Investigations have found no evidence whatsoever of wrongdoing. The relevant academic journals also found no basis for the claims. Now, there have been questions since about his academic work. However, if we had a media fit for purpose, with its near infinite resources and money, why wasn't the claim of plagiarism being unsubstantiated not also widely reported? Why didn't the media give just as much coverage to the filthy racist that is Nathan Koffness, who started this entire saga based on his own admission this was a personal vendetta? If we care about balance, and the media says it does, with every accusation of plagiarism, why was there also not a counter-narrative to say, it's not being proved yet, it's unsubstantiated, and this is the person who's making these claims? Ben, the claim of plagiarism was the entire thrust of the story, yet it turns out that at least most of it wasn't even true. So was Jason Arday killed based on a lie?
I kind of disagree a little bit that the thrust of the story wasn't, was all about the academic plagiarism. I think there was more to it than that. But I think he was killed based on a lie, but that wasn't about questions of honesty or plagiarism. It's not that Jason Arday wasn't like a flawed individual, but rather the lie is that he was uniquely obtuse and that his ascension was almost entirely to do with his racial background. I think that is the lie that got him killed. I think the things he was advocating for in his academic career have fairly good like academic backing. Just for example, his PhD thesis was on the benefits of like less hierarchical student-teacher mentoring and reflective practice. And it does seem to show that this is like a positive thing, and it's something that student teachers, as in people training to be teachers, by the way, this does seem to help with the overall kind of like outcome of making more rounded and analytical students. It's all kind of good stuff, and in lots of ways that's sort of like just a positive in itself. Like even if the plagiarism accusations were true, the things that he was advocating for are well grounded and seem to be well backed up, and that is one thing to bear in mind. Plagiarism is something like academics do have to be strict on, and unless you've seen it from the like academic perspective, you won't understand just how strict they are. And I am inclined to believe on the academic stuff, if they say that he fell within the standards, he probably fell within the standards. And it's worth bearing in mind as well that there is a drought of original work in the humanities due to like a lack of research funding, particularly since the austerity years began in like 2010. And this does usually lead to multiple references and citations being made to the same like idea or set of ideas. I do have to say it like it is. I think there are things in his personal life that he did lie or exaggerate about, and with some of his personal achievements, but it just doesn't justify this response from the press. Now, News Corp, who analyze they do macro analysis of the press. They're a great organization. I thoroughly recommend checking them out. News Corp found that there were 249 press articles that had been written about him in a period of less than 3 weeks. We're talking about a guy who maybe told some tall stories, right? The Telegraph alone published 50 articles on him. The Telegraph has roughly 16 million unique viewers in terms of people reading its website each month. So that's sort of 16 million people reading 50 articles on him, which is just an absurd amount of pressure for like one person to take on. And there's a contrast that I want to bring up actually, because I think it is actually important. And it shows that it's kind of not about plagiarism. Matt Goodwin. Do you remember Matt Goodwin? Matt GPT, as he's now known. He wrote a book full of AI bullshit. He also uses his academic credentials to lift him up. But the Telegraph wrote one article about him. Like one article about that book, about his plagiarism. I guess it could either be seen as plagiarism. I would regard AI as plagiarism, but that's a personal opinion. His use of AI, shall we say. And 3 more articles they published that sort of mentioned that AI dishonesty in passing of Matt Goodwin's. So generously, 4 articles were written about Matt Goodwin. who is like a far more prominent figure with far more power, and there's far more wealth in what he does. But there was only one article about him specifically and 4 in total from the Telegraph. So it clearly isn't about like plagiarism. Like they don't really care much about plagiarism. And bad citation in supposedly academic work, right? That's clearly not it. It also isn't about honesty. Keir Starmer, like probably the most dishonest prime minister we've ever had, serial liar, but no one kind of cares. It's not about lying or about plagiarism. It's about the belief that a black academic could only be in his position through false elevation. It aligned with their worldview. That's what it was about. That's why the Telegraph was willing to publish so many articles about it. It wasn't to do with, to do with a genuine concern about like the quality of academia in Cambridge. No, absolutely not. One of the things it highlights is we do need to majorly get the press in this country under control. And it always reminds me a little bit of talking about. I'm always going to bring Nazi Germany into every conversation. Apologies, but I am, because I'm going to say that I once asked my lecturer about, okay, so in terms of standing up to the Nazis, who could do what? And he was like, well, that depends heavily on who you were, because the crime in a fascist society, in a dual state society, as Ernst Frankl would say, in a state where there is a normative law for most people and a prerogative law for those with privilege, the crime is not just the crime. And in this case, the crime isn't dishonesty. The crime is dishonesty plus identity. And without those two things, it just doesn't take off in the same way. Apologies, I'm waffling a bit. Go on.
I want to slightly push back a bit, but I think it also could be a problem with my framing the question. I do think plagiarism plays a role, but I suppose the way I asked the question was it was the main story. I think what I meant to say was I think it was the thrust in which it was the thing that lit the fuse. I think we know that the larger point about Jason Arday was the racism, which is that as Kofnas was saying, this person could possibly be there without some sort of help from insert DEI, insert wokeness. I mean, the entire smoke and fire from the media was purely racism. It absolutely was. And it was his race was used to attack the idea of racial equality or policies that we can do to improve society, to get more representation in certain aspects of society. But I think that the plagiarism aspect was the thing that lit the fuse, because it's a serious accusation. And they needed to use plagiarism to then jump off and then start making spurious accusations. Now, of course, if plagiarism had nothing to the story, I don't doubt that this still would have been covered if he'd lied about, a marathon. But I think that they managed to create. I think they managed to have this story permeate across 4 weeks because they kept pushing down the idea of plagiarism. And again, people would take that seriously. Now, I do take your point when you say about, well, Matt GPT, he technically plagiarized in his book, and there was only a couple of stories on that. Where I would slightly push back on is I agree with you that using AI to write shit is absolute plagiarism. The wider media doesn't see it like that. I don't think the media particularly cares about AI. One, I don't think a lot of the media really understand it. And two, I don't think they think that whether it's generative AI is stealing other people's artwork or whether it's just not doing proper research. But then again, I mean, I'm sort of even conflicting with myself. I think you're absolutely right insofar that they could have done a full week press coverage of Matt Goodwin, but they didn't. And obviously, he's white and he's right wing. There's also that as well.
Was he? Was it before or after? I can't actually remember. Was it before or after he lost the Gorton and Denton by-election? Was that?
Good question. I think
I can't actually remember because that is.
Also it might have been. I know it's really close. I think was it just before, or just after? I mean, that had nothing to do with his election loss, obviously. Although to be fair, though, even GB News for a while took it quite seriously. In fact, GB News really went for him, and our friend of the show, Andy Twells, did a complete number on him.
He did. It was pretty good. It was just after, but like either way, I do think that the fact that he was a political candidate, like he was clearly somebody who Reform were willing to put forward as a potential candidate, maybe one of 5 MPs in a future governing party, and the lack of criticism that he received compared to the criticism that Jason Arday received for, like, I'd say as much bullshit. And as much consequential, at the very least, bullshit. In fact, I'd maybe even argue that Matt Goodwin's bullshit did a lot more harm because
it absolutely did, didn't it?
Yeah,
because Matt Goodwin, like, he wrote an entire book basically demonizing immigrants, right? And that has a huge issue in society. If you've got some inaccuracies or you lied about like marathon runs, that clearly doesn't have the same level of power in society or shape the narrative. I look, it's 5-8. I do want to ask you my second question, though. No, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's it's really important to get into. But I think this is also a very important question. Is that Arday had autism, and 1 in 4 people have attempted or thought about suicide. So my question to you is: do you think the media and their lack of safeguarding this is actually representative of wider society? And on this specific issue, it's actually not just the media to blame, it's society as a whole, the way in which we treat people with autism.
Ableism in society is a real problem, and I think there might be something to that. Jason Arday did clearly struggle, like he was non-verbal throughout like much of his childhood, and if I remember correctly, those stories in some of the stories in The Guardian that I read about him were corroborated by friends that he had in his school days. So I think his struggle with autism genuinely real, and I think that the general like ableism probably takes a sort of a backseat. It's a bit more subtle. I think it is present, but I think it's a bit more subtle than the like racial element being present, because DEI, people always think of it as like a racial thing, even though DEI is absolutely what Nigel Farage is doing, for example, when he's talking about like needing to talk to working class people, or the everyday man down the pub. DEI, it's he's speaking to particular identity groups to try and to try and speak to their struggles. In a way, it is kind of the it's identity politics at the very least. But I do think there's a wider question here, though, that there needs to be a reinforcement of the right to privacy and limits put on the number of articles that the press can publish about a private individual. So, for example, a publication can publish 2 articles, say, about a teacher before they're required to stop, but you might allow them to publish 10 articles on a national political figure. But ultimately, these are any question about the press. We fucking need Leveson too. We really do. Any question about the press is a question about the concentration of power. And that really is what needs to be broken up, so that like vicious little wankers like Confus can't use it to take advantage, knowing that people like Jason Arday will receive so much more scrutiny than similarly placed people who have committed the exact same transgressions, or even worse transgressions. And use that to like destroy their entire lives and make them representative of groups, because there's so many black academics in the UK who are now going, well, my work might come under the same level of scrutiny, and I don't want to draw the attention of the press, which only worsens the problem. But this is what like awful little wankers like Confus want, because they want people like black people, they want minority groups to step away from putting themselves out there. It is sort of a macro intimidation tactic used against minority groups to artificially shape the world as they want it to be. And frankly, Confus shows his own intelligence with his statements. I can't stand it when people like that and he just looks like such a wanker. But also, I can't stand it when people like that, when ugly little frauds like that get involved and make the lives of minority groups measurably worse on a national political stage by manipulating our extremely corrupt media. Something needs to be done about the concentration of media power.
Yeah. I think you're right to say that like the ableism aspect was very, very subtle. And this is not again any excuse for the media, by the way, but I do think it's definitely an issue of wider society, because ableism is very individualized, invisibilized. Like racism isn't.
Yeah.
There's obviously subconscious racism that we don't immediately pick up on, but we talk about racism a lot. Ableism isn't, and I can actually see a lot of people rolling their eyes when we say Jason Arday had autism too, and that could have led to some of the difficulties he's had. A lot of people are like, oh, what else have I got? We've all got something, you know. And I think that's a knee-jerk reaction. That's a societal problem. I think that's not excuse the media.